Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Fabish. I am the co-founder of Conscious Family Law and Mediation. And as part of our series of interviews featuring leaders in the field of relationships, communication, growth, and transition, I am very pleased to welcome Gabrielle Usatynski. Welcome, Gabrielle.
Thank you, Peter. I'm so happy to be here.
Really glad to have you. Gabrielle is a licensed professional counselor and expert in Boulder, Colorado, right here. She is the host of a new TV show, Iconic Couples in History, and the founder of Power Couples Institute, where she trains therapists worldwide. Gabrielle has been featured in numerous publications, including Cosmopolitan, Counseling Today, and Women's Health. And her book, The Power Couple Formula, will be released later this year. Gabrielle is happily married to her husband Ted and lives close by in Broomfield, Colorado. Very impressive credentials, Gabrielle, and really happy to have you here on the show and excited to talk about some relationship stuff.
I'm excited to talk to you too, Peter.
Um, Gabrielle, having known you and observed your work, I'm aware that you have an approach to thinking about relationships and working with couples that I think is really different from the norm and may, in fact, even sound controversial to some people. Um, I was hoping you could tell our audience a little bit about that and about yourself and how you approach working with couples and thinking about couples.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think the best way to start is just to kind of say a few things about what our cultural beliefs, understandings, and really myths are about intimate relationship, because um, those really fly in the face of what we know from all of the research that's been done into what makes relationships successful and enduring over time. So if we look at kind of the cultural perspective that we have, we tend to be very focused on the individual, the needs of the individual, the life of the individual, individual aspirations, and our culture really rewards people who place their own personal development, and you could say their sense of self, sort of at the fore. And I think that there are obviously a lot of good things about that, and it's one of the things that has actually been an asset of Western culture in general, if we compare it to Eastern cultures that are perhaps on a traditionally more collectivist in a certain way and had less of that sense of focus on individual identity. But the downside of that is that we tend to we've developed a certain attitude about intimate relationship that doesn't actually reflect what we know to be true in terms of how people can experience satisfaction and create lasting relationships that stand the test of time. So we tend to have this. So what I mean by that, when I'm talking about this kind of cultural idea about relationships, is that we tend to have this idea that your happiness is something that should come from within, and it shouldn't be dependent on another person, on your lover or your partner, and that you should be looking after yourself essentially, and they should be looking after themselves, and that your well-being isn't their problem. It's not their job to um, care for your well-being, and nor is it your job to care for theirs. And so I hope I got that. I meant both ways. So we have this kind of model where if our partner does something that in any way is upsetting to us, that we should kind of distance ourselves emotionally and focus on maintaining an even keel and not sort of let that affect us negatively. And that, in fact, if we experience some kind of need or anything like that from our partner, it's a sign that we are enmeshed with that person, that we don't have good boundaries with that person. And so I'm sure as I'm kind of describing this, I'm imagining it kind of, you can sort of understand what I'm talking about in terms of how, what we think of when we think of creating a relationship, that our society values, one with two people who are self-sufficient, essentially, and who come together as two wholes, with who are mature and respectful and have good boundaries and so forth. So, um, the problem with that is that it doesn't actually mesh with what we know from the science about biology and psychology and, um, marital outcome studies and how people actually make it in the long run. And we now have hundreds and hundreds of studies that have confirmed the very same thing, which is that, dependency is actually the name of the game when it comes to creating, relationships that last and that create a high level of satisfaction.
Well, now, can I just stop you right there? Because I just for a second here right now. So, what I'm hearing you say, there's our cherished ideals about individuality in this culture show up in relationship, and you don't actually necessarily have a problem with individual growth and individuality and healthy boundaries in general. I'm not hearing, but what I'm hearing you saying is there's a sort of a clash between that cultural value and the insertion of that into relationships and with science and with research as to how relationships actually work well. Is that a fair capture of what you said so far?
That's precisely a fair capture. Yeah.
I mean, and so right away, well, I'm going to save that one, but yeah, so continue.
Right. Okay. So, there have been, I would say, really for the past 30 years, research into, the field of adult attachment, um, what we call attachment theory, which is the science. We can't really call it a theory anymore because it's been proven, across the lifespan and across all cultures. But the idea about that there is actually a science to how we bond with other people, um, and that there are certain basic, principles that guide, successful attachment that we see in all relationships that involve successful attachment, whether those are parent-child relationships or those are intimate relationships. Um, I think, just to take a step back, we know now that people need warm, secure relationships with other people, as John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, said, from cradle to grave. So, warmth, security, safety, um, in relationship is not just something for children. It's something that uh, human beings, and that human beings need all across the entire lifespan.
Right, because we hear from attachment theory, right, that an infant is evolutionarily designed to need attunement with its mother in order to thrive. And in fact, I think I understand that brain development is actually influenced by the level of attunement that happens between caretakers and children. If there's a severe break in attunement, it can, over time, it can actually cause the brain to develop differently and less optimally as an infant, right? So we're aware of that, but you're saying that that need for attunement doesn't go away once we grow out of infancy, and in fact, not even when we become adults.
Correct. And so I can cite, for instance, the Harvard study of adult development, which was first published in 2012, by Harvard University, which was the first, I should say, the longest longitudinal study of adult life ever conducted, which began back in the 1910s, something like that.
I think so,
Um,
yeah.
Yes, where they looked at, among other things, what are the factors that lead to human happiness over time. And they followed this original group of research subjects who were originally men, but ultimately they added women to this group. And the study was handled by like 4 different people over time, right up until the present, and it's actually still going on. But the primary finding of this study was that warm, secure relationships are far and away the most important contributor to adult happiness, more important than fame, than wealth, than professional success, um, or any other factor. And that uh, warm, secure relationships are so important that people who have those into adulthood and into later life uh, experience better mood and memory. They are physically much healthier. They live longer, and this is a big one, they make more money.
See, there's always an economic incentive for that, right?
That's right. So I think that was really quite shocking to a lot of people, to find that out. So it becomes not just a question of preference here, but whether to engage in such a relationship, or to get to the bottom of what it means to create such a relationship, but really of an imperative. It's really about our very well-being, our ability to thrive as human beings. And um, so that's really kind of my mission, is that this is so important to people's physical health, to their mental health, to their longevity, to their success, and I would argue to the well-being of the planet as a whole, that it's critical that we really get to the bottom of what successful intimate relationships really entail.
Mm. Yeah, no small mission here.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, let me circle back for a second then. What got me sort of prickled up earlier and aware was when you got to the end before I cut you off of your first answer, and you used the word dependency, and you said that that in fact we need to be looking at. I'm paraphrasing. I don't want to get you wrong, but is not how we can be independent within relationship, but how we can actually foster, or at least be aware of, and work well with the reality that we have dependency on other human beings. And that word, of course, just got my whole Western mind just going, whoa, dependency.
Right, right. It's kind of a bad word, in our culture, right?
Yeah.
It sort of goes along with codependency and enmeshment and other words like that, right? So, first of all, dependency isn't in intimate relationships. It's not really like a choice. It's more of a, for one way of looking at it is, first of all, is that it's a biological reality, because couples, we know, being in an intimate partnership, couples regulate each other's physiologies. In other words, we are impacting each other's nervous systems, our heart rate, our breathing, our blood pressure, um, our immune system. All of those things are being regulated just by virtue of the fact that we're in an intimate relationship with another person. And that doesn't happen with any other kind of relationship. It's a special thing, because of the nature of the bond, which is a special bond. Um, and so that's not really something that you can argue about on a biological level. That's happening whether you like it or not. In fact, the most recent research now is showing that we affect each other's RNA, so through breathing. So if you think about that for a minute, so in other words, the people who you are around the most, who you exchange breath with the most, you are actually having an effect on the very genetic material of that person's makeup, that person's composition, and they are affecting yours. So, and that's hot off the press in terms of the impact on each other. So this is especially true with couples where you're living with somebody, you're probably sleeping in the same bed, you're, interacting more with this person, hopefully, than you are with anybody else. But we can look at this. So that's kind of the fact of dependency, right? And we know that when couples are in conflict, when they're in a toxic relationship where there is fighting all the time with no repair, there is, uh, trauma, abuse, neglect, criticism, the four horsemen of the apocalypse that Dr. John Gottman talks about that end marriages: criticism, stonewalling, defensiveness, and contempt. When those types of things are going on, we know that it will literally burn out people's immune systems. It'll burn out partners' immune systems. Um, and they'll get sick, physically sick, right? So
Mm.
you can understand the impact of being in this kind of intimate partnership, is by its very nature one of being dependent
Mm.
on the behavior of the other person, how
Yeah,
you're being
but
treated, and how the other person and how you're treating them.
right. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I thought you
Oh
had
no,
a
no,
thing.
I'm done with that part. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so I know you, Gabrielle. I know that, and one of the things I appreciate about you is that you are actually engaged in the science of what you work with, as well as just the art and the practice of it. And so am I correct in presuming that when you talk about, well, we know that these we have these effects on each other, particularly in intimate relationships, that this is based on actual research data. Is that correct?
Yes, everything I'm saying has, um, a great deal of research behind it. And I'm talking about this. So far I've been talking about the concept of dependency from a more physiological or biological perspective, but we can also look at it, from more of a psychological perspective, in terms of accepting what our role is in relationship with our partner. What are we doing here for each other? Why should we be in a relationship at all? And so we know unequivocally that there are certain, things that partners, in secure relationships and satisfying relationships accept about the relationship. And those things have been kind of, are boiled down to, in a way, three things, although I think there are definitely more. But Mickelinser and Shaver, who are two of the foremost attachment researchers who really spearheaded the field of, adult attachment research, um, found that there were three qualities that needed to be present in every securely attached relationship. And those are what they called availability, sensitivity, and responsivity.
Mm.
So being available to each other, means that you are you are available to each other under any circumstances. So not just when it's convenient for you or whatever, but that you guys actually know, both partners know, that they can, reach out to each other in times of distress and receive quick distress relief from each other.
Mm.
Um, Sensitivity has to do with being sensitive to your partner's needs. Responsiveness has to do with responding to their distress cues. So those were three things that, they saw needed to be there in order for relationships to last. And, the interesting thing now, a lot of that, again, it's so contrary to how we think, right? Culturally, we still really believe that, fundamentally, your issues are not my problem, and you come to this relationship with all of your childhood baggage, and I shouldn't be responsible for that. That's really your work. It's kind of a narrative that we hear a lot.
Mhm.
um, the fact is
I've
that
heard
that
that
does
narrative inside my head at times.
yes. No doubt, no doubt. The problem is that it doesn't actually hold up because we are going to project our all of our significant relationships onto our intimate partner. We are going to project everything that came before that. Our parents, our previous lovers, all of our relational injuries. And we just, so what we understand in terms of how people actually work successfully with that is that we accept that. And we accept that we need to provide a corrective experience for our partner. We
Mm,
need to be different to them than all of those people who came before. And part of the reason for that is because our brains aren't very good with time. We don't know the difference between the past, the present, and the future. We
mm,
actually don't. So you, in a sense, on the level of the right brain, which is, and the deeper brain, which is the part of our brain that is activated in our intimate relationship, I don't know that you're different from my mother or my father or the guy who beat me, you know. The only way I'm going to learn that is if I have some kind of a new experience with you that disproves that.
okay, right. So um, I know the conscious part of my brain knows that my wife is not my mother, nor is she my first wife. She's my second wife. Um, so my brain knows that on some level. What I think I'm hearing you say is there's another level, a more fundamental level, and a level that actually affects me in many ways that are important, in which I don't know that I'm actually experiencing her as my mother or as my former lovers. Is that fair?
Correct. And the to just flesh that out a little bit more, that's because it's not the formal cognitive thinking part of your brain that's in charge in your intimate relationships. It is the limbic brain and the brain stem, what they traditionally refer to as the reptilian brain, and the limbic brain, the feeling brain, um, which are these deeper, older parts of the brain that are actually running the show. And so we have neurobiologically a threat response system in the brain that is designed to keep us safe at all costs. And that developed over a very long course of human evolution from the time that we were living on the African savanna and being chased by wildebeests, and we had to, act now and think later, right? Because if we had stopped to really think, well, did this wildebeest eat breakfast this morning? Are they after me or is it that guy over there? If you had stopped to think those types of things, you would have been dead. So we have this part of us that's very good at getting us out of what we perceive as danger very quickly, but doesn't actually think about what we're doing or what things mean. That all comes later after we've already acted. And that is the part of the brain, all scientists agree, that gets activated in intimate relationship when we feel like we're under threat. And so this issue of threat response is it's paramount. It's like people have a lot of ideas about how they should be, and a lot of lofty philosophies about how they should act and how people should be in relationship. But when it actually comes down to it, we are driven by the automatic brain
Mm.
in intimate relationship because of our sensitivity to threat.
So this is I think where you may differ in your way of thinking about this based on the science, right? That in intimate relationships, we find ourselves experiencing threat. That threat is perceived by our more ancient portions of our brain as very serious, perhaps even on some physiological level, almost equivalent to a threat to our safety and health, and maybe even survival.
And I
And
would just say not almost, but definitely, right?
okay.
So we don't that part of the brain doesn't discriminate, and
Mm,
that's important to understand, right? So we're not, that part of our brain by definition doesn't say, you know, this is just my intimate partner. It's not that saber-toothed tiger, or it's not my mother. It's not, that part doesn't have that capacity to discriminate that way,
Mm.
right? And just to yeah, and the problem is that when that part, when couples do things that are threatening to each other and that deeper brain gets activated, that threat response gets activated, it actually hijacks the formal cognitive thinking part of the brain,
Hmm.
and that goes offline,
And
right?
and that goes offline, as my wife likes to say in her teaching around authentic relating. We've got our ancient part of our brain covered by our more recently developed
Yes.
parts, our frontal cortex, and we flip our lid.
That's
Um,
right. And that's the work of Dan Siegel with this very wonderful hand model, right?
mhm,
One of the, yeah, foremost neuropsychologists of our time who developed that kind of easy way of looking at the different parts of the brain, where you have this limbic brain here, and then this brain stem here, and then this formal cognitive that has the capacity to calm and soothe these lower parts, right? But the problem is that if this part is out of control, these parts, this part, it basically is deactivated and can't resume control until these parts have calmed down,
mhm.
right?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good visual.
Yeah,
So, and that's I think what people so often refer to these days as being triggered, right?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and and I can say from personal experience, I have in subsequent moments of calm looked back on moments of trigger when I've been willing to actually stop and look at it objectively and looked at it with a certain level of wonder. Wow, uh, just didn't put away the dishes, but it was like um, there was something really important on the line, and I reacted accordingly. Um, and so what I think I'm understanding you to say, Gabrielle, is that that's where I want to bring in this word of responsibility. That where you might be talking to people about what's your responsibility in a relationship for working with the other person's particular paths to trigger. Is that right?
Yeah, and the fact is that I don't have an agenda personally about what couples should and shouldn't do. In other words, I can tell you what the research says about what creates satisfying, enduring relationships, but it's completely up to the couple to decide if that makes sense to them. They can agree to absolutely anything they want. But the issue is it has to work for both people, right? If it only works for one person, it doesn't work at all.
Um, so, Gabrielle, I know that a important part of the lens through which you look at relationships is attachment theory
Hmm.
and how it applies to adults, which we found that it does apply throughout the lifespan. It's my understanding that an essential aspect of attachment theory is attachment styles, which
Hmm.
will typically develop very early in life and can carry with them throughout life. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how attachment theory, what is it very briefly, how does it apply to your work, and what are these attachment styles?
Sure. Well, we know that children will form their behavior into predictable patterns that will, you could say, maximize the availability and responsivity of their primary caregivers. So that means that, let's say, I grew up in a family where I learned that um, if I cry out, you know, let's say I want to be held, I'm a baby and I want to be held, and I cry out a little bit and nobody comes. But I learned that if I cry out a lot and I make a really big fuss, then I'll get some attention, right? So that would be, you could say, a learning experience that is teaching me that in order to get something I need, I have to make a really big deal about it, right? And so if you have a certain type of experience, like that's a certain pattern, right? Where my behavior is being patterned in a particular way by a certain interaction sequence with a parent or a primary caregiver. And if I have that same kind of sequence happen to me multiple times over time, it becomes, you could say, sort of solidified as a relationship template. That part of my template, my learning about relationship, my internal script, you could say, is that if I need something, I got to make a big stink about it, right? Um, which, that could be something we might see in the case of anxious attachment. Um, but all right, so that was just an example to give you this idea of how behavioral patterns sort of turn into these relationship styles, and or you could say a relationship template, and we carry that template with us into our adult intimate relationships. So we will expect the same kinds of things that we expected in relationships when we were children. We will have the same kinds of fears in relationship, the same kinds of triggers, the same sort of need for proximity or distance from a primary partner. Um, in other words, our parents become kind of like uh, representatives, you could say. I'm sorry, our intimate partner becomes like a representative for these important attachment relationships that we had in the beginning.
Mm.
So, and really, we're talking about 0 to 12 years old, kind of as the attachment window, you could say, for when those blueprints get formed. So it's really childhood that we're talking about here. And in terms of attachment styles, we know that there are 3 basic attachment styles that essentially almost everyone in the world, with the exception of about 10% of the general population, will fall into one of 3 attachment styles. And those are secure attachment, avoidant attachment, and anxious attachment. And then you have another 10% that would fall into what we would call disorganized attachment, which is really has to do with people who experienced a very high level of trauma and abuse in their early relationships with their parents or primary caregivers. And that's a different kind of attachment style that has to do with a lot of sort of chaotic and unpredictable behavior in relationship. So it's different because the 3 main styles, secure, avoidant, and anxious, are all highly predictable. In other words, um, if you have one of these styles, you're always going to do and feel the same thing in a given situation. So, for instance, um, if I am avoidant, I'm always going to feel pretty uncomfortable if you get too close to me because I need that sense of personal space, and that's a predictable response. Um, if I'm anxious, I'm always going to feel rejected if you turn your back on me. That's a predictable response. So there's a predictability to the 3 main styles that we don't see with the disorganized style. That with disorganized, it's kind of like anybody's guess how the person might respond in relationship because of that early trauma and abuse that was so kind of fragmenting in a certain way. But just to come back to these 3 styles, just really in a nutshell, secure attachment, which represents about 50% of the general population now, basically develops when a child is able to use their parent as what we call a safe haven and a secure base. And what that means is that a safe haven, it means that I can go to my parent when I'm in pain, I'm lonely, I'm demoralized, I'm afraid. I can go to my parent and or call out for a parent and receive distress relief. And I can also use my parent as a secure base, what's called a secure base, which means that they become kind of a platform from which I can explore the world. I can go out and explore the environment, knowing that my parent has my back. And I can always come back to them if I need to, if I have to retreat or anything like that. So those two functions, the safe haven and the secure base, are really kind of the hallmark of that creating that secure attachment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with avoidant attachment, there and with anxious attachment, there is some kind of um, rupture in those two functions. So with avoidant attachment, for instance, children learn that they can't use a parent as a safe haven because the parent is not available to the child. It's a low contact environment in families that produce avoidant attachment. There tends to be an absence of physical affection. There's an absence of social emotional communication in general. The child is expected to pull themselves up by their bootstraps way too early and look after themselves. So there's a lot of shame for needing anything from anybody. Um, and that tends to produce children who are very averse to closeness. They don't like interpersonal contact. It's very stressful for them. And as adults in intimate relationship, they tend to have a lot of difficulty both with their partner's needs, attachment needs from them, and certainly also expressing their own needs in an intimate relationship,
Mm-hmm.
right? Finally, with ambivalent attachment or anxious attachment, those are the same thing. Um, it's a different kind of environment than what we see with the avoidantly attached child. In the anxious, in families that produce anxious attachment, we see a pattern of inconsistent caregiving. So sometimes the parent is showing up for the child and rocking the child, soothing the child, kissing the child, being affectionate, and so on. And sometimes they're really not. So they're preoccupied with their own problems, or they're depressed, or they're being, uh, mistreated by their partner, or they're overwhelmed with too many other children, or whatever it is, right? So it creates this inconsistent caregiving. Sometimes you're there for me, sometimes you're not. And as a result, it makes the child feel very ambivalent, there's that word, about being in contact with another person.
Mm.
Because even when the relationship feels good, they kind of are waiting for it to turn sour because they've been here before and they know how it goes.
Mm-hmm.
And so this can create, as an adult, once they reach adulthood and they engage in intimate relationships, it can create a lot of self-sabotaging kind of behavior, where, this is feeling good, but I don't know, you might drop me, you might abandon me. So I'd better do something now to hurt you, or kind of um, in some way destroy this, because I need to do that before you do that to me. It's kind of a self-protective move, you could say. So
It'll hurt less if I do it than if you do it.
exactly, right. um, so anyway, I'm giving you just a very cursory overview of these three styles, and there's a lot more to say about the hallmarks of each of them. And but anyway, just to give a little bit of orientation for our call.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is it possible for someone to have more than one attachment style running?
That's a really good question. I think what they have found is that, well, there's this is a really interesting subject because um, if you people can look different in different relationships. So, and I think a lot of times people have a sense of that for themselves if they know a little bit about attachment styles. They kind of might say, I was much more avoidant in that relationship with that person. When that person, that super needy person, I became much more avoidant. But then with this person, I feel like the tables have turned and suddenly I'm more in the pursuer, position or something, right? So I think sometimes people can play different sides of that. And I think part of what makes this complex is that when you try to assess somebody's attachment style as an individual, they can often meet the criteria for a certain one of these styles. But then if you look at their their behavior in their relationship, they don't look like that at all.
Mm.
And so it kind of tells you how much more fluid we are as human beings. That these categories are, in a sense, kind of human constructions where we're trying to make sense of data and behaviors, and sort of funnel them into something that we can relate to and use. But I think, in my experience, I think that people often mistype themselves. When you take an attachment test online, people usually mistype themselves. And I think a lot of therapists mistype clients. So I think it's actually quite subtle to really get this right. It's not always apparent. But in any event, people are dynamic and fluid, and definitely these things can change, and certainly change over time. As people create healthy relationships, they can move more and more towards secure attachment.
Mm. So, healthy relationship in and of itself can actually move somebody from an avoidant or an anxious attachment style more toward a secure attachment style.
100%. And I actually think that's the way you just phrased that is very accurate, because we want to use the relationship as the change agent. That when people start behaving differently toward each other and changing the relational space between them, that actually in turn changes them as individuals,
Mm.
rather than looking at sort of the traditional way of thinking about change, which is much more individual centric. Like, sort of like, for instance, if we look at the psychoanalytic tradition of psychoanalytic psychotherapy, where, you would work on developing insight about your behavior and your problems, and then that insight would lead to you changing your behavior. We're actually flipping that on its head, and we're saying, let's do a different behavior with each other, and then the insight actually comes out of that, and we actually change. Our inner experience of ourselves changes as a function of how we changed our behavior. And that's really a hallmark of family therapy in general. Kind of like one of the revolutions that happened with family therapy and couples therapy is, in a way, it became very much about changing what we do and how we treat each other, because we don't actually have time to wait around until people sort of develop the insight and self-awareness to change their relationships. um, I mean, this is something that I really love about what I do, because people come into couples therapy and family therapy in such a high level of pain, and they need to do something now to get out of pain. They can't wait until they kind of understand everything about themselves and why they did it and where it came from and all of that. There has to be something now that we um, can get these people out of pain right away. And so, in a way, we're using action as the change agent for personal change. We're using what's happening in the relationship as the agent to change the individual. And I love that perspective, because what we're really saying is the relationship is what's primary. The individual is a derivative of the relationship.
Mm.
And that's not usually how we think about our individuality. We usually think of ourselves as primary, and the relationship is an outcropping of the self.
Mm.
But
Yes.
yeah, yeah. But
Very
I
good.
think family therapy as a movement kind of turned that on its head.
Mhm.
So so
Yeah, so you said to me something along those lines of that you often get people coming in and saying, well, I'm not responsible for the other person's trigger. Why should I be responsible for them? And I think you told me that you engage in with a line of questioning around that for the person that you're talking to.
right. Right. So that's a very common, right, attitude, as we're talking about, because a lot of people have that attitude from what what they've learned from our culture. But of course, that's also an attitude that goes with a certain kind of what we call insecure attachment, which is avoidant attachment, which is that people who have an avoidant attachment style will very often, part of that is the rejection of being needed and also needing. So it actually goes both ways. I don't need you. You shouldn't need me.
Mm,
Let's just have sort of a low demand, low contact, low expectation environment, and
mhm,
I'm good.
mhm,
Right. So that's kind of the avoidant attachment mentality. But in therapy, usually that person's partner is very unhappy, right? Because you have one person who is expressing lots and lots of needs, right? And then this person's like, I'm fine. My only complaint is that they stop complaining. That's what I want, right? So, but to get back to your question about responsibility, um, very often this goes both ways. So one person's saying, well, I'm not responsible for my partner's triggers. But when you question the other person, you find that actually this person who's saying that they are not responsible for their partner's triggers is expecting their partner to take care of them in a certain way or respect them in a certain way, honor them, see them, give them something that's important to them. So, and they get very unhappy when they don't get that. So this is really the core problem when it comes to insecure attachment is we see that um, people very often expect the other person to give them, to do for them, to be the partner that they want them to be. They may not see it, but they're doing it somehow, right? But when the shoe's on the other foot, they don't feel that they should have to provide that.
mm. Yes, that was actually where I was prompting on that last question because you, when you and I have spoken about this in the past, that's where you really kind of started getting me on board. I had to be honest with myself about a couple of things. First, that I came out of my family of origin probably with an avoidant attachment style. That I don't need you, the kind of I don't need you, you don't need me. But you know what? Underneath that was also yeah, I do need you, and I do need you to actually be doing certain very particular things. And if you're not doing it, I've got a problem. But it's pretty hard to see that that's coming from me when all of my focus is on, well, you didn't do this or you did that. And if you just did that or didn't do that, then everything would be fine. And then noticing where, on the other hand, yeah, actually, I did engage in a lot of that.
Hmm.
And then on the other hand, also would sit there and go, well, coming from an avoidant style, well, why do you need me to do this? This is your issue. You really need to look at your family of origin and kind of work this stuff out. Maybe you should talk to a therapist.
Right, right, exactly. So all of this, so you see the inherent unfairness in how this plays out relationally, right? Where we're very good at seeing kind of what the other person isn't doing for us, but then when the shoe's on the other foot, we say, well, and really where that harkens back to developmentally is coming from families where we did not see reciprocity, where we did not see people taking care of each other, parents who took care of each other, who understood each other, who worked together to create win-win solutions. And also, the hallmark of insecure families in general is that the parents do not follow the needs of the child. So, if we grew up in a family that was an insecure family system, one of the hallmarks of that is that there are other things that take priority over the needs of the child. Um, in a secure family system, parents should be putting the needs of the child first. In other words, trying to practice what Dan Siegel calls contingent communication, which is being available to pick up on a child's need, um, receiving the need, interpreting the need, and then responding appropriately to the need. That's contingent communication, and that needs to be present in securely attached systems, whether they're parent-child systems or adult intimate systems, right? So when that's not going on, children, it's because there's something else that is more important in that parent-child relationship than the needs of the child. And that is usually either the self-esteem of the parent or the, the feelings of the parent. So the child is in some way responsible for taking care of a parent, either taking care of their self-esteem by being the child that they want them to be, getting the good grades, looking good, keeping their room clean, whatever it is, or they're responsible for actually caring for the parent's emotions, being the parent's confidant, the shoulder to cry on, the arbitrator between the parents when they get into an argument. So all of these things are jobs, you could say, that children have to perform that they should never have to perform, but that get in the way of them having the experience of coming first. And because there's a debt there, you could say, that because they didn't actually have that experience as children of being put first, when we get to intimate relationships as an adult, there's an actual, you could say, an emotional debt there, that nobody put me first. And that's what Benjamin, who was a famous Eastern European family systems theorist, his idea was, this is like what he called the revolving ledger, which is like, okay, you didn't get it then, so now you're an adult and you're going to do whatever you need to do to get that unmet need met here.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't take care of you. I can't give you what you want because I was used back then. So now I'm going to get my due. I'm going to make sure that I get what I need.
Mm.
Right?
Yes, yes. Well, I think you just gave a very accurate description of my journey up to a point. Yes, I was the confidant, the shoulder to cry on, the arbiter, the good boy, and then showed up in relationship with those demands,
Yeah.
and that played out for a lot of years. Now, lest we be fatalistic and imagine that because I am imagining almost everybody watching this, if not everybody, has some version of that they came into relationship with and has had the experience of relationship not going as well as they would want. Let's think a little bit about what can be done. I feel like I've gone through a healing journey with relationship, but what I'd like to hear is you talk a little bit about, well, how do people do it? Does can engaging in intimate relationship and the ways that you talk about it and that the science supports have the possibility of healing us and getting us to a point where we less and less are acting out in these insecure or avoidant ways?
Yes. So the overarching answer to that question is yes. And this is really kind of the wonderful, miraculous thing about what we know about human development is that people can come from insecure family systems. Even two people who both come from insecure family systems can come together and create a relationship that is reflective of secure attachment. That despite their insecure histories, and you could say relationship templates that they're bringing with them to their intimate relationship, it's possible to create something completely different that neither of them had, that neither of them experienced growing up, and to create what we call earned secure attachment.
Mm.
So it's they can rework their template, rework the relationship template so that it becomes a secure template. Um, so that's really good news, and actually, really, that's sort of the foundation of what couples therapy should be about.
Mm.
Is that we're helping people to heal those original templates and engage in something new, and that has to be based on doing it. We do it. In other words, it's very action oriented, right?
Well, it's actually it strikes me that it's a matter of just of being convinced that you're going to get more of what you want by changing your actions, because I was very actively engaged in attempting to get my partner to meet my needs and to avoid having to meet her needs in ways that I didn't think I should have to. And that wasn't working out all that well for me. And having shifted approaches, I'm actually finding I'm acting still, but I'm acting differently, and I'm getting more of what I want.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So to come back to like your question, like what do we do about this? So in a way, it's the most obvious thing, but it's also the most counterintuitive thing for a lot of people. The obvious thing is actually to meet the need. It is for both people to have needs, lots of needs of each other, and to meet those needs.
Mm,
And somehow we have this idea that, I shouldn't have to meet your needs, but understand that that is in and of itself a reflection of insecure attachment. Because in insecure families, there's a lot of what we call shame for dependency needs. You're not allowed to be dependent, right? It's not acceptable to the family because you have to do something. You're expected to do something else, right? For them. So a lot of people have a lot of shame around needing from another person.
mhm,
And so they also, conversely, they will not accept that their partner needs them in very specific ways.
mhm,
And they will feel a lot of resentment about that, right? So, but what we want is for people to be able to use each other for all of the things that we know couples need to be able to do for each other. It means creating distress relief, being available to each other, sensitive, responsive. Um, and what happens there is, and the other piece of that is, and this is a hard one for a lot of people, is making the relationship your number one commitment. Now, not everybody is on board with that. And if couples decide that there's something else that's more important to them than their relationship, and they both agree to that, I don't have a problem with that personally. But the problem is that because relationships are reflective of that early bond, they're an expression of that deep need for connection and security. Um, it feels inherently unsafe to people when something else feels like it's more important to the other person than you are.
mm. So, what I'm hearing you say is that we actually accept that we have needs, that this is a natural human condition that we probably can't get out of, even though we may think we don't have them. We become aware of those needs, and it seems like I know certainly from part of my journey and my wife's as well was actually just developing enough self awareness to know what our needs were.
Right.
Being willing to express those needs to another person and and deal with the shame that might come up out of a historical conditioning, and then be willing as the partner to meet each other's needs, and that this is actually, if we really want relationship to be secure, these are the kinds of things we need to be willing to admit and to do. um, and that this and then to also prioritize the relationship first. And I'm assuming that does not mean oh, I have to give up my career and I have to give up my softball games in order to be in a healthy marriage, right? It's just there's some way of signaling that the relationship is gets the most priority, and I'd love to hear more about how that's done.
Right. Well, it depends largely on the nature of the couple. But um, when people feel like uh, they can't, for instance, their partner is unreachable during the day, go to work and they can't talk to them all day, that's going to be a problem for a certain type of attachment style. We call that the anxious or anxious ambivalent, angry resistant, something like that, attachment style, right? That some people need more frequent contact with their partner in order to maintain a sense of security and connection. And that's the kind of thing that needs to be taken seriously, because it's part of understanding your partner, understanding how they work and what they need in order to be to relax in the relationship, right? So where people have a lot of fear that, well, if I put my relationship first, that means I'm going to get nothing I want. My career is going to go to pot. Um, you know, um, I'm not going to get my personal needs met. And the interesting thing about that is that, again, what the research shows is it's actually exactly the opposite. And I want to go into this a little bit because I think it's a really important point. There's something that's been identified as the dependency paradox by a couple of researchers, and again, famous attachment researchers, Feeney and Thrush. And they did some really interesting research about 10 years ago where they looked at the relationship between, or I'm going to just say it as they're saying it, a partner's independent goal striving as a function of their partner's acceptance of dependency. So in other words, when partners accept the other partner's dependency on them, it turns out that that actually makes them much, much more autonomous, much more independent, and they are much more likely to achieve independent goals.
Mm.
So the more people accepted that, yes, I am responsive to my partner's needs, I am sensitive to them when they're in distress. That was what they called dependency acceptance. That actually was associated with the partner's experience of their own independence, their own self-efficacy, and their ability to engage in independent exploration and achieve independent goals.
Mm. Fascinating. It
Yeah.
sounds counterintuitive, but it sounds like you're saying the research supports this. It's very interesting. And honestly, I can say my personal anecdotal experience is very consistent with that. As my partner and I have grown more willing to meet each other's needs, we've both seen our individual success in the world um, increase. And I wasn't aware of the research, but it's interesting to hear you talk about that. But I gotta say, I gotta come back to this, and I'm imagining some people are going to be thinking about this. So, and it was stirred by your earlier example of the person with insecure attachment needing to be able to get a hold of me while I'm at work. The big question I think that always comes up in talking about this stuff, or may come up for many people, it certainly does for me, is where does my responsibility or where I'm being called on to act end and the other person's need to work, do their own work begin. So if I have a partner who's really insecure and feels like if she can't get a hold of me 30 times a day when I'm at work, that she's going to have a panic attack. Where does it you know where does my need to meet her needs end and her need to work on this stuff begin, or am I even
Right, right,
asking the wrong question?
right. So let me ask you a question in response to that question, and then we'll take it from there, okay?
Sounds good.
Um, do you think that it should be, and I suppose this is kind of a personal question because I'm asking you personally, right? Do you think that it should be partners' jobs, that it should be their responsibility to do an excellent job taking care of one another?
Hmm. I want to give an honest answer to that. Um, I will admit that I still have a part of me that balks at that internally in some way. That's my avoidant attachment tradition, probably still rearing itself. But honestly, when I pause and look at it, I would say yes. I do think given that we are clearly dependent, I do accept the understandings of attachment theory, and I accept that we have that it's a really good thing to. Do we think it's their job? I want to parse your question. I'm giving you a long answer, sorry. But is it my job? I don't know. Maybe that's the wording that's bothering me. I think what I would like to say is if I want to be in a really healthy, intimate relationship, I'm going to have to accept the reality of how humans work, and I do want to be in a healthy, intimate relationship, and so I'm willing to put in the work. So then it does, yes, become my job in some degree to be an excellent partner.
Yes, in other words, it's a chosen job. It's not something that's being imposed upon you, which is perhaps the I'm guessing kind of the concern around the word job. But if we understand what's at stake and we understand what's needed in order for our own personal happiness to create this and our own health, our own wealth, our own longevity, right? We can make it purely about what it means for us is that we do need to adopt a certain attitude toward one another. And that then becomes our sacred responsibility to each other,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if we accept that it is our job to provide excellent care to each other, um, when I say to people, do you feel that you do that with your partner? Like, let's say, this person's calling their partner at work 30 times a day, and I say to that person who's at work, do you feel like you do provide excellent care? And they say, well, I wouldn't say excellent, you know. Um, and this person's saying, well, actually, I can't ever get a hold of you, right? So what we very often see there is that the person who's complaining about if I give her an inch, she's going to take a mile. It's a little bit of that mentality, which again is what we would call an insecure script. It's an insecure working model, and to use the clinical term, it's an idea that this person's bringing with them to the relationship based on their history, which is basically saying, I can't give you a little bit of what you need, because if I do, you're going to take me for all I'm worth.
Mm.
And so I'm not going to give you anything. And by not giving you anything, what's going to happen is you're going to ramp up. You're going to start escalating. And then I'm going to be like, you see, it wouldn't even matter what I do. It's
Mm.
not going to work, right? So there's a whole kind of dynamic around this issue that happens. And there's actually an architecture that we need to follow in order to unravel that. The first step is to get the person who's withholding to actually move toward their partner and do the thing, whatever the thing is that their partner says that they're needing. And once they do that, we're able to work with that and say, okay, well, what happens to this person now that they're actually getting what it is that they want? Are they able to take it in? And if they're not able to take it in and they're continuing to call 30 times a day, that's a problem.
Mm.
But you can't blame that person for calling 30 times a day when they're being neglected.
Mm.
You see?
Yeah, no, I that all makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it tracks well with my own experience over time. Um, because I was, yeah, I think in a lot of ways, even in my second marriage here, where things have kind of evolved from a lot of challenge to a really relationship that feels really good for both of us. I was playing the avoidant role, and um, I did have that exact fear, that if I start giving into this, that it's never end, and found that when I and the other piece of that is, yeah, I my script was, well, I used to be running a nice guy racket. That was how I tried to get along in the world, was, oh, I'll take care of everybody else, and then and then I'll be taken care of, and then I found that I wasn't taken care of, and so I'm running around acting like a nice guy but feeling all kinds of resentment, and that wasn't healthy. That didn't work, and so as I moved out of that dynamic, then this sort of other dynamics would take over of just being avoidant, um, and those overlapped as well. So, but then we've moved over time into a place where I found like, okay, I can meet your needs without risking annihilation, and then they calmed down, and it went in both directions. So I can really see how that's worked in my experience. But at the same time, there's this whole book of knowledge around what you mentioned earlier, which is codependency. In fact, there's
Mm-hmm.
a whole 12-step program around it,
Mm-hmm.
codependency, and so and I notice it's so interesting. Even as I have put your practices into practice in my life and seen the benefits, I still find myself internally sort of balking at some of this stuff as you talk about it. So it's an interesting struggle. So there's two things I want to ask about there. How do we work with that cultural conditioning in the midst of all this? And um, how do you distinguish between healthy dependency and codependency?
Mm-hmm. Well, they actually couldn't be further from each other, those two things. I think I'll start with the second part. And I think you and I have discussed this before. Codependency was a term that emerged out of the Alcoholics Anonymous movement, like back in the 70s, where you had an addict who was dependent on a substance, and then you had the partner of the addict who was, in a sense, dependent on the addict in the sense that they were unable to, you could say, set clear boundaries or draw clear lines in the sand for themselves about how they were being treated. So, in other words, if you continue to lie to me, if you continue to, waste all of our money on your addiction, and you beat me or whatever, I will leave. I will end the relationship, which would be a healthy expression of self healthy, what some people call healthy selfishness, right? Where you're willing to stand up for yourself when you're being mistreated, which is an expression of the real self, right? And it's something that we need to be able to do, and it's a hallmark of secure relationships. In other words, people should not stay together no matter how they're being treated. That's not a secure relationship. So codependency was, that was the word that was attributed to somebody who had that kind of profile, where they can't get out of this relationship, where they're being thrown under the bus, and they're dependent on the sense of connection with that person, and they are unwilling to stand up for their principles because they don't want to be abandoned, or at least the experience of abandonment that would come up with the end of a relationship would be so severe that they are willing to tolerate anything to avoid the end of the relationship. So that's codependency, and we can see that in in many relationships all the time. We see people who are being constantly thrown under the bus, and they're unwilling to actually end it. They might threaten to leave, but they don't actually do it. And that's an expression usually of what anxious ambivalent attachment, because of the fear of abandonment. That's really the core issue there. Um, so they're afraid to throw down. They're afraid to say no and mean it. And so that is an entirely different kind of situation than, in fact, than what we're talking about when we're talking about healthy dependency, because you can see how those things are actually completely different. Because if somebody were expressing healthy dependency in a relationship like that, they would be saying, my needs for comfort, for security, for safety, for soothing, for joy and contentment matter. These matter. And I'm willing to stand for these needs even if it means our relationship is over. That would be an expression of healthy dependency,
Mm.
because I actually value my own dependency needs so much that I'm not willing to do this to myself. I'm not willing to self-harm, because that's a form of self-harm, right? So does that clarify the distinction there between codependency and healthy dependency?
Yes, yeah, that was really helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Good.
And I asked kind of two questions lumped together that really don't exactly were a good flow. But the other piece of this is even so, having had the experiences I've had, and finding their benefits, and getting healthier inside of myself and how I show up and set boundaries, and yet also meet my partner's dependency needs and ask for what I need. I still find myself on some level sort of reacting sometimes when you say things like dependency, or things like there's still a part of me that sort of wants to jump to that, that cowboy
Mm-hmm.
independence, and it's pretty deeply ingrained. So how
Mm-hmm.
do you work with that when you're in a relationship and you're wanting it to be healthy, but you're also wanting to have healthy boundaries, and so on, and deal with those thoughts.
Right, right. I think, as we said earlier, it's a difficult word for a lot of people, which is why I think the more popular word in this terrain has become interdependence, that
Mm-hmm.
relationships are interdependent. And people tend to like that word better because it feels less, it's just less triggering. Less people feel less vulnerable with that word. But really, all interdependence means is that dependence goes both ways, right? Um, so we're not really saying anything different here. But I think, as with anything, when we have a strong reaction to something, um, that we know now from the research is a reflection of a clear model of health, right? That dependency is actually part of what we need to come to terms with in order to be in a successful relationship. If we have a strong reaction to it, it's important, just like with anything inside ourselves, that we investigate it, that we drill down and try to really understand really specifically what because there's some kind of fear there,
Mm.
right? There's some sort of anxiety, worst case scenario, something that we're probably afraid this means. And it's important that we develop the self-awareness to really understand what that is, because our own self-awareness is critical to to our success with our partner,
Mm.
right?
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, if I even take a few seconds to look at that for myself, I can immediately see fears of losing my sovereignty, of being leaned on and then not getting my needs met in an appropriate way. It clearly goes back to my childhood experiences. So
Precisely, precisely. So just in that little inquiry you did right there, you can see how these things run so deep in us. And if we're not careful, it's very difficult to even see it because of how culturally sanctioned that attitude is. That, well, you shouldn't be reliant on another person. It's just so culturally accepted and valued. Um, and that's really why I like to, and I feel it's important that we look at these things also from an evolutionary perspective, in terms of human evolution and the importance of um, the pair bond, because humans have been pair bonding for 200,000 years. Pair bonding meaning pairing up with one other member of the species, and that was for our own survival. Because two heads were better than one. We had a better chance at protecting ourselves from environmental threats. And we also, and very importantly, had a much better chance of raising children successfully, who would then so that we could pass our genes on to the next generation. So it gave us a much higher level of evolutionary fitness. And it also set us apart from other species, because mammals developed these, were the ones who developed the whole concept of the parent-child relationship was a mammalian invention. Mammals were the first group that actually, where there actually was a parent to raise young. Before that, all the other species were, you lay your eggs, and those little guys hatch, and hey, they're on their own, And so this was such an enormous, it gave mammals such an incredible evolutionary edge over others. And I don't think that that is really any different today for us. There's a reason to be together that has to do with our very survival and the survival of our children. And I think in a way that I don't want to get too sort of far afield, but I feel like that really does relate to divorce as well, because children need the influence of both parents. They need both parents in their lives, even once a divorce has happened. We know that children who have both parents in their lives do so much better than children who are raised in single parent households. And the importance of fathers in child development cannot be overstated. And so all of these things have such deep kind of evolutionary roots, that children are very vulnerable. We're what's called primarily an altricial species, which means that we are born very vulnerable at birth, and our brains have a very long period of growth that takes time. It takes time for us to learn how to be with other people. And we need both parents in our lives in order to teach us um, how to be in relationship, because those are our very first relationship blueprints. It's how our parents are with us, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, where there's a couple of threads that I just want to follow, and I know we're getting a little short on time, but
Yeah.
one of them is how would you respond to? So I'm thinking in terms of the cultural influences. Two of the things that come to mind for me are the sort of masculine feminine distinction, as it's been traditionally looked at it in Western culture. There's this sense that men are supposed to sort of man up and be independent and handle things on their own, not be dependent. And it's almost, and it can be seen as more of a sort of feminine need or trait to have dependency needs. And so there's, I'm imagining, and have actually experienced some sense of like, well, it's just not masculine to have dependency needs. And there's that. And then the other piece of it is just there is a strong cultural value in terms of being independent, being willing to take care of your own, taking responsibility for your life, being able to handle things on your own. That doesn't seem to me to be entirely wrong, entirely bad in some way. There's some way that I sort of feel drawn to that as well as the old sort of masculine feminine distinction that I mentioned. Um, so yeah, how do you talk about those things with folks?
Well, you're bringing up a number of issues, but I'm just going to jump on one of the last ones, which is, it's interesting to me that you're contrasting taking responsibility for your life with engaging in a relationship where both people are openly expressive of their dependency needs, because I actually see those things as the same thing.
Mm,
That part of taking responsibility for your life means understanding that it's, you could say, you're right as a human being to engage in a relationship where that is where you feel totally loved, where you feel totally accepted, where you are a giver and a receiver, that is fair, balanced, sensitive. To take responsibility for creating that type of relationship is a true act of self-activation, because um, it's articulating who you are and what you want and being able to stand for that.
mm,
And if that's not taking responsibility for your life, I don't know what is.
mm. Well, one first has to acknowledge that that's something that they actually want and need, which sort of brings us back to this acculturation between. Well, I don't think I don't think it's fair to say that it's broken down strictly along gender lines by any means. I'm sure many women experience some version of this, including I'm certain my wife would say that she's had that sort of sense of like, well, not being needing needing to be able to take care of herself, not being over dependent, not wanting me to be over dependent on her. Um, so it's not just a male female thing, but there is that sort of like I think traditional cultural distinction that runs.
Yeah, for sure. I don't question that. I completely agree. And I agree with everything you're saying because I think there are, those things are divided along gender lines to a large extent in terms of how we view the typical, I don't, and maybe ideal male, and that the female on the other hand has traditionally been kind of viewed as the caretaker of the relational space, or something like that. And then but the man being maybe more career oriented and more, focused on the external world or something like that. But you're right, those are much more, I would say, largely attachment related attributions than they are gender, because you'll see plenty of women who are very averse to having needs, to being needed, and you'll see plenty of men who are much more oriented that way, right? So that has much more to do with attachment than it does, I think, gender fundamentally. Although our culture tends to produce more avoidantly attached men and more anxiously attached women, so that's part of probably why how those things intersect.
Yeah.
But it doesn't quite answer your question though, like how do you work with that? So again, to me, this is a question that I put to the couple: is what do they want? What kind of relationship do they want? And if one person wants a relationship where people take care of themselves, and another person wants a relationship where they take care of each other, that's an inherent problem,
Mm.
right? Because
Well, I think,
those are fundamentally different types of relationships.
don't you also though end up finding that the couple may present that way, but when you drill down a little bit, you find that the person who's saying, "Well, I want us both to just be independent," is actually seeking to get their dependency needs met in a sort of sideways way while not wanting to meet the needs of the other person. Isn't that often the case?
And that's really, as we were discussing earlier, that's precisely the case. And actually, it's really the avoidants who are the ones who say, I don't have any needs. You're the one with all the needs here. I'm fine on my own. Who actually turn out to be in the neediest when you really drill down, because there's so much need for self-protection, for that fear of annihilation, actually, that you briefly touched on earlier, in yourself, is that need to protect the self from fragmenting is so profound that and then we have this kind of defensive layer around that. So part of what we're doing then in therapy is we have to be able to break that down right from the beginning and help that person understand that this is a coping strategy, you could say, that they learned very, very early. And the fact that it's the result of a high neglect environment. And that's a difficult thing for people to stomach, really, because they're not used to
Mm-hmm.
thinking of themselves that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, and that's really consistent with my experience.
Hmm.
I came from a high neglect environment. Came in feeling like I'm really independent and don't have needs of me, and yet yeah, I had a lot of needs that were being covertly sort of reached for in the relationship and not acknowledged by
Hmm.
myself.
Hmm.
And so yeah, it's and moving out of that into just a more open understanding of what are my actual needs and how can I meet the actual needs of my partner. I think has just led to me to feeling actually much more powerful in the world. Far from being moving from sort of this rugged individualist to wimpy codependent. It's been actually, in many ways, the opposite movement, being
Mm-hmm.
sort of a wimpy individualist, with quotations and marks around it, but to a powerful person who can be in relationship. Um, so I mean that's, when I fight against my internalized prejudices and really look at the reality of how my life is played out, I can tell other people, men and women, who may be listening to this with some skepticism of where it could go for them, that the journey is toward health and power, within the context of interdependence.
Yes, yes, wonderful. And also, as Dr. Stan Tadkin would say, true dependency, I'm sorry, true independence arises out of dependency, not out of neglect.
Mm, nicely said.
Yeah,
Um, so, last thing I wanted to ask you about, Gabrielle, do you have time for one more question?
of course, yes.
Um, so, you know that I work in the context of divorce, and I think many people that find their way into my office, somewhat bewilderingly, are discovering that their approaches to being in relationship didn't work out. Many of them feel in a space of blaming their partner for why things did not work out. Whereas in looking at the situation through the lens that you bring, I can see where each person had lots of responsibility, and many times it was in being, um, wanting their own needs met without really understanding what those needs were and not being willing to meet the needs of the other. So they're now going through divorce, but they're codependent. They're co-parents, excuse me. How would any of this apply to those people? Would you teach? Can they still use these principles to manage their relationship with their co-parent going forward?
Right. Very important question. So, relationships, I think it goes without saying that as we move from an um, committed, intimate relationship into and that breaks up, and then we divorce, we're not going to. It's very natural for couples to move toward a more self for partners to move toward a more self-protective mode, right? Because they're not th- that that attachment bond that they had is breaking up. They are no longer um, going to be providing the same kind of things to each other that hopefully they were providing. Although, if they were, they probably wouldn't be getting divorced. But you understand what I mean, is that obviously we're not expecting from divorced couples that they're going to be, available to each other whenever they need to talk about something, or they're going to, you know, um, practice the kinds of things that we would be wanting to see in an intimate relationship. But nonetheless, there are still principles that I believe are in the partners, in the co-parents' best interest to subscribe to, that can guide their relationship as co-parents. Because um, their relationship, even once they're divorced, is still going to form the primary relationship template for their children moving forward. Even if those divorcees get remarried and have more children, their biological children are always going to look at them as the exemplar of intimate relationship.
Mm.
And so they need to see parents who can co-parent in a way that they are practicing fairness with each other, that they're practicing sensitivity, that they are responsive to each other's concerns and needs. Um, what we know from the research is that children will watch how one parent deals with the other parent, and how that parent deals with the other parent becomes the model for how that child will deal with that parent. So I hope I'm saying that clearly enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's actually more important. How the parents relate to each other is more important to the child in terms of their relationship with each parent than the parent's direct relationship with that child. That's how important the parents' relationship with each other is
Mm-hmm.
to the child's formation of healthy relationships, and specifically relationships with each of those parents. So when we get, if we've been in a toxic relationship and we get divorced, we're going to do, studies show it. I mean, we will do much better than we would if we stayed in something that was slowly eating away at us. Right? We're going to do much better. At least, I should say, for women. I think you've probably seen this research that women do better when they are divorced and they get out of a relationship that was um, not healthy for them. They tend to do much better, whereas men, this is what uh, we've seen. Although I don't know that we fully understand this, but um, men tend to do better married than not married, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I assume you're familiar with what I'm talking about, but maybe not. I don't
It's
know.
somewhat, I haven't actually read the studies, but I'm familiar with, I've heard some talk of these things, and I've also observed, and it's somewhat anecdotally, without really drilling down the data, that it does seem that men seem more likely to get remarried more quickly than women after divorce. I don't know if that's actually borne out by the statistics,
Hmm.
but
Hmm. Hmm.
I feel like anecdotally I've seen that occur, and I wonder if that's just sort of a survival sort of instinct,
Hmm.
acknowledging that they're going to do better in a relationship, in a marriage, regardless of
Hmm.
how good it is.
That's interesting because one thing I do know about in terms of the rates of women getting remarried, if women have children, I believe 75% of them are remarried within 2 years of their divorce. So
Interesting.
that's a very high number, which makes sense simply because the burden of raising children alone is so costly.
Yeah,
So
interesting. But what I think what I want to boil down, and the last thing you said was essentially, well, once the marriage breaks up, we may not be having me, my ex spouse, and I may not be having as profound an impact on each other anymore in how we relate to each other, but we're certainly having a profound impact on their children. Um,
right, right,
so,
and yes.
so being able to apply these principles even to a co-parent of being basically able to ask for what you need, to meet the other person's needs, to be aware of your and the other person's triggers, is very crucial from the perspective of your children.
Yes, because what people don't know is that your children know way more about what's going on between you and your ex than you think they do.
Mm,
Children pick up on stuff. They are sponges. They hear everything. And so don't think that they don't know what's going on.
mm-hmm.
Your children are watching. It's kind of a scary message, but it's true. So if you won't do it for the sake of you and your ex, do it for your children,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Learn to create something with your ex that you would want your children to emulate in terms of fairness, um, empathy, equality, those types of things.
Mm. That's a great message, and I think it really does motivate a lot of the people that I see who come in wanting to collaboratively divorce, even though they've come to the end of their marriage, and sometimes are really actually still pretty angry at each other. They're really motivated to do the best things for their children, both parties, and so it's a strong motivator.
Absolutely. And it should be. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Gabrielle, I really appreciate the time. It's wonderful always to talk to you. You're so deeply steeped in in these issues, and your knowledge and your research of the research and so forth is very deep. And so always appreciate to hear your perspectives on these things.
Well, it's been a pleasure to speak with you too. And I'm very grateful that couples have an alternative to acrimonious divorce that they can pursue, which is collaborative divorce. And I know that that can be a very useful path for many couples who have decided to break up. So I'm grateful for the work that you do as well.
Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's good work. It's good work. It's good to have good work.
Yep. Amen.
Yeah. Well, take care then, Gabrielle, and good luck with your endeavors. I'm excited to see your television show. Let us know when that comes out.
Thank you. I sure will. Okay. Take
Okay.
care.
Bye now.
Bye.